We will now continue a focus on experiments, but while we in the former session focused on lab experiments to illustrate the nature of a randomized controlled trial, we'll now focus on what we call field experiments, and I'll try to explain what these are, why we run them. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of running a field experiment compared to a lab setting? So again, just sort of to reiterate the main points, the randomized controlled trial is a particularly strong and useful way of trying to get to the causal nature of a possible relation between two things. So because we randomize participants into two more or less identical group and make sure the environment around the experiment, both in the control group and the treatment group, is as identical as possible, and we only change one thing, then we can be quite confident that we have established whether something works. Let's say it's a headache pill. If we gave the headache pill to all 100 people and let's say they all had their headache removed, well, we lack the counterfactual. We lack insight into, well, what would have happened if some of these people did not receive a headache pill? And that's what randomization is for. That's why we carry out an RCT. But we also have to remember, as we heard before, that causality should not be considered as a binary thing. The validity of an experiment is not a binary thing. It's not yes or no, true or false. It's more of a continuum. And this relates both to the internal and external validity. Internal validity being what is the truthfulness or what is the validity of this particular study in this particular context. So of the Riley study with bionicles, how certain can we be that we can trust these particular results with these particular groups of people in this particular setting, etc. While external validity is then saying, well, we are not only interested in figuring out whether this one particular study and with its particular setup is true. We are actually also interested to know, can we learn something about the world more broadly? So we focus quite a bit on that. On for instance, used Riley's bionicle study to make us think about, well, what's the strengths of the external validity? To what degree do we think we can say, well, it happened to have been run on male Harvard students? Do we think that this also applies to the population more in general? The study relied on a very, very simple task of building bionicles. Do we think it will also be meaningful in other settings where we do other tasks? So the aim was to really get a sense of that we should not say a study has good or bad external validity. We should be more specific in terms of thinking about interaction between selection and treatment, interaction between setting and treatment. It's run quite a few years ago. Would the results still apply into the social world we see today, etc.? So these were the internal and external validity trade-offs that we saw in lab experiments, and it was clear that especially external validity was challenged. I want to sort of give a little tweak to the concept of external validity, because external validity is a very broad concept, and while ecological validity, that some people also sometimes use, is more literally whether whatever study you've done, it also works in the real world. And here we have an example. I've mentioned mice studies before. We actually have a study that shows that if you run studies that you usually run in a lab with lab mice and then put these mice out into the natural habitat, it turns out that some of the results that we get are actually different. So it matters whether we have people in the lab or whether we have people in the real world, or here it was mice we had in the lab or in the real world. So that's what ecological validity is saying, is how well are the findings applicable to the real world and everyday life. So this is a subset of external validity. But external validity is completely broad. It can be generalized to other settings, another lab, in another country, other kind of participants. This is whether the bionicle study would also make sense in an organizational context, for instance. And the point being that you had to build bionicle that might be dismantled right in front of you for very small monetary rewards. Does that really match what we think happens in organizations? Do they really carry out such small and simple tasks? Are things really dismantled in this way? So that's the challenge of lab experiments, and that's why we focus on, well, how can we then get stuff? How can we get these studies out into the real world? And that's really the promise of field experiments, because they are run in the field. So, sort of to highlight the point and put it slightly differently, so that even if a lab experiment is as well done as well as possible with as high internal validity and external validity as we can sort of imagine, it's still often generally based on student samples. It still will take place in an artificial environment. People know they're part of an experiment. I mean, you sign up to be part of something. You show up and you get paid usually. These experiments are often also fairly brief. They might last a couple of hours. If they're really long, they might last half a day. So what if we want to study real world situations over a long period of time and really involving real stakes, where like whether you get fired or promoted or not as an employee in a company, for instance, rather than the difference between getting $2.40 or $2.1 for building a bionicle. We want to get out into the real world, and that's what field experiments do. We still test claims of causal relationships. We still randomly assign subjects. It's still a randomized control trial, but a distinguishing characteristic of field experiment is that conducted in real world setting and often unobtrusively, meaning that participants might not know they're part of an experiment. I'll show a couple of examples of that here in the following slides. So, but the key thing is they're done in the field. I mean, the name sort of gives it away. Just to give an example of it, so O'Reilly's bionicle study was trying to figure out whether it's important to see the fruits of your labor and whether that makes you more productive. That was O'Reilly's sort of setup. That's his claim. That's what he wants to investigate. And the argument is that even sort of such a silly situation where your bionicle is dismantled and right in front of you, this is sort of counterproductive. But it's and it's one thing that it's done on males only, that O'Reilly could in principle sort of have dealt with that. But can we actually in a meaningful way translate that into a proper organizational real world setting? Well, that's then what Adam Grant is talking about here, and the study that I'm referring to here on the right is, well, we could answer the same research question, so roughly the same research question, by saying, I want to investigate how important meaningful work experiences are. And so here is an experiment done on a group of employees in a telemarketing company that were to call people in order to raise funds for a good cause of sorts. And what they've done is they've created 4 different conditions. An experiment doesn't have to be only 2 or 3 conditions. It can be as many as you want almost. You're still sort of comparing across these conditions. So here we had a control group. Here we had a group where the employees at the telemarketing company, they sort of heard about good stories that happened when they had actually raised funds for the cause that they were arguing for. This did not really make a big difference. Here, in this condition, they actually heard about life-changing stories. Let's say they managed to raise funds for someone's education, and they heard about the story of this person actually getting funds for education, and this was a big deal for this person, of course, and this had an impact on how much money was raised. This is what the bars here indicate, how much money is raised by these employees on average. Yet meeting the recipients, so actually meeting someone who got money based on the work done by these telemarketing employees, really had a substantial impact, plus 400% in performance. This really had a substantial impact. So this is just to show a very simple example. The research question was whether it's important to see the fruits of your labor. Well, this is basically what Adam Grant did in the study here. He compared telemarketing employees that were either just sort of in abstract learning about how important their work was, maybe they actually heard about a specific story about a person who benefited from it, or they really met the recipients, and apparently this had a substantial effect. So now we've investigated in a real world context an actual organization that were divided into where the employees were divided into different conditions. And so the external validity is clearly a lot higher. I mean, still, it might only work for telemarketing companies, or maybe it only works in, I assume this was the United States, and there can still be other limits to it. But we've taken it outside the lab, so the ecological validity is clearly a lot higher. And our sort of trust in whether we can generalize this should be a lot stronger. And just to give you a couple of more examples to highlight why we sometimes need a field experiment to study something. So this is a very well-known economic study. Big question is, does it actually matter to learn about management practices? So there were a group of researchers who went to India and did a field experiment on a large Indian textile firms. So they provided free consulting on management practices to randomly chosen treatment plans. So there were textile companies who had various manufacturing plants where they produced this textile stuff they produced, and some of these plans were selected and they got free consulting. So the manager of these manufacturing companies, they got free consulting, and then the aim was to compare the performance of those that got the treatment with those that didn't get the treatment to see, well, did performance increase? And actually productivity increased by 17% in the first year, and which is quite, I mean, that's really a lot. These facilities were quite big, so this was really a big impact. But of course, the question of does management matter? In principle, you could have created an artificial environment and taught some participants in the lab some management practices, and then they maybe had to create an artificial company and see who sort of managed this the best. It's of course far more convincing to be able to go to companies and then not just sort of do an artificial thing, but really do it on the real thing. Still, in terms of external validity, who knows if this transfers to Denmark, United States, or China? We could sort of have a discussion on that, but it's certainly a much higher validity than any lab study could have. And actually, the same group of authors actually followed up on these textile companies 10 years later. So they revisited the plans in order to find out, well, do the effect actually still hold here 10 years later? And as they show here, there was still a large and significant gap in practices, and even there was even a significant performance gap between treatment and control plans. So even 10 years later, they could still see the effects of the management practices they helped to implement a decade earlier. So again, this is then showing not only does it have a short-term effect, but we can have a field experiment where we can show that it actually also has a very long-term effect. Logistically, this is of course really difficult to pull off this research because it literally takes 10 years to run. But it ends up being a very convincing and compelling case for the importance of management practices. Okay, I suggest now that you pause the video and read the example given here. It's taken from the textbook chapter on experiments. So try to read this and consider, is this a proper randomized controlled trial, and what kind of experiment is this? So if you pause the video, you have a chance to read it for yourself. I'll just continue here. So key things to pay attention to is here, okay, so it's experimental participants are salespeople working for a North American insurance company. So these are actual employees at an actual company. And they were invited to participate in a study. And you had to be able to commit yourself to 4 weekly training sessions, etc. So there was some kind of selection going on here, and 60 individuals volunteered. But then they were assigned randomly to experimental and control groups. So it's there was a randomization going on. Maybe the original 60 people are not typical salespeople. So maybe they are sort of particular individuals who have the time and the motivation to participate in some kind of training program. But they were randomly assigned to one or the other. Okay, then members of this, the experimental group received training and self-management over several weeks, and the control group did not receive it until much later in the future. In fact, a year later, so that's quite a bit later. But here we have an opportunity to then compare the performance of people that got the experimental treatment with the control group that have not gotten the experimental treatment yet. And they assessed effectiveness at 3, 6, 9, 12 months, and it turns out the hypothesis was confirmed. The experimental group performed much better than the control group at each point on the various effectiveness criteria employed. Furthermore, after 12 months, when the control group went through the training program, the differences disappeared. Then they were sort of at the same level of performance. So what's the takeaway here then? We can do a randomized control trial in the field. We can have a randomized setup. We can sort of try to make a manipulation that is sort of quite clear. Either you get the management program or not. But you could also speculate, well, how controlled is this environment? How certain can we be that people from the management, so those that were in the experimental condition, did not talk to people that were in the control group? This is difficult to control. We can't sort of, at least not in most countries and companies, you can't force employees not to talk to certain other employees. And even if you did that, that would sort of create a weird, awkward situation. So we cannot be 100% certain that there wasn't some kind of communication. So we could actually imagine that the insights from this management course, this training program, was quite easy to convey to others. And this could have led to a situation where those that did not participate in it yet heard about it from those that did participate, and then they all sort of improved just as much. So if the result had been a null result, if they didn't find any significant differences, let's assume that. Let's assume they were not able to find any significant difference in the experimental treatment and the control treatment. Well, this could have been because the sort of information was leaking between these two different groups. That's a challenge you have in these field experiments. So in this way, this is a nice example of the quality and the strength of a field experiment. You are actually finding out whether this works for this particular company, but there are risks involved in terms of not being 100% sure about the internal validity. Another example that we also had the last time was whether face masks protect against COVID, the Danish study that I talked about the last time. And just want to point out, that's then a field experiment because it's run in the field. It's people that live their everyday life that you either wear masks or don't wear masks. So it's an experiment that is in the field, and that's why we call it a field experiment. We could question the internal validity because actually they weren't investigating whether face mask protects. They were sort of more indirectly investigating whether informing about face mask and sending out face mask has an effect, as we discussed the last time. But it's another example of how it's more difficult to control this. If we had put people in a lab and just sort of hypothetically had a group of 50 people where they were all wearing masks and another group of 50 people that didn't wear masks and there was an infected person in both settings, then we could have investigated whether they got the disease or not. This would not have been, we would not have gotten ethical approval for running such a study, of course. But in principle, the internal validity of that study, that mask study would have been better. The internal validity would have been better. But we want to investigate how people behave in everyday life. I mean, it's difficult to put people in a group where they might realize they were sort of in a situation where COVID plays a role and then they might change and adapt their behavior to that. Here we had people as they were living their lives. An example I actually used last year, as you can see, the tweet is from February 19, so this is not COVID related. You can pause the video if you want to sort of read the essence of the study as it explained here. What it's being shown here is that influenza mortality in cities that participate in the Super Bowl, so that's American football, in cities that participate in the Super Bowl is higher. So what they're able to show is, based on data from 74 to 09, they are comparing cities that end up having their team, so to speak, in the Super Bowl, and then they're looking at how many the flu death do we actually experience right after the Super Bowl is played in late January, early February, compared to cities where the team is not in the Super Bowl. And it turns out that there seems to be an 80% increase in the flu death for the population over 65. Is this in a field experiment? No, and the reason is that the researchers have not allocated cities to participating in the Super Bowl or not. This is done sort of by whatever sort of happens out in the world. One team beat the other team, and that's why they ended up there. But it's not controlled by the researchers. It's not researchers that have flipped the coin and said, today San Francisco gets there and New York doesn't. So it's still an interesting study, and we'll get back to this example later, by the way, at the end of lesson 3. But it's not a field experiment because it's not an experiment. It happens in the field, but it's not a randomized control trial. So a point I also want to emphasize is that we're constantly exposed to field experiments, even that we don't know it. I told you how Amazon and Google and Netflix, etc., they run thousands of experiments every year, and you're also part of those. Whenever you sign up to, you sort of accept the terms and conditions of these companies, and of course you read those carefully, right? You are accepting to be part of experiments, and here where it's being written about the New York Times, they often in the morning will test different headlines. So readers of New York Times will be randomly selected. So some readers of the New York Times will be randomly allocated to different groups, and for this particular study, the headline might have been, which businesses should reopen first? Your favorite restaurant might be a super spreader. Is it safer to visit a coffee shop or the gym? So basically, the ones in charge of writing headlines, they didn't really know which of these three might be the best and generate the most attention. You can yourself think about one. Do you know which one would be the winner? It turned out to be number 3. But this is a good example of a newspaper that realizes we can try to guess which headline is the best. But why not run it, expose, let's say, 1,000 people early on in the morning for this 333 in one, etc., and 333 in the second and the third group. Let's see who clicks on the link the most. And if a certain headline functions the best, well, by all means, why don't we just use that headline for all the articles the rest of the day? This wasn't just a one-time thing. This is something the New York Times does continuously, and I'm sure if Danish newspapers are clever, they should do something similar. I don't know if they do, but it's fairly easy in these online settings to do this. That's a clear advantage of the online settings. So just to summarize some of the perspectives here, we've tried to compare lab versus field experiment. I've tried to illustrate why and how we can run these field experiments, but also then the pros and cons of this. So it's clear that it's more real behavior. It's not as artificial setting if you're in a field experiment. The ecological validity is higher. But the examples then of the sales insurance company also illustrate you might have less control over variables. You can't be 100% sure that for instance, participants in the experiments aren't communicating with each other, or that something else might be going on. So the randomization, the clean randomization could be a little bit more difficult because you don't know if people from different groups are communicating with each other. But it could certainly be a more relevant sample. It's not just students that study sales, but these are actual people that have to do the sales at an insurance company, and you will really want to improve their performance, so that you have certainly a relevant. You can have a more relevant sample, but it's also much more resource demanding. As you can see, for instance, the insurance company study in total took 15 months or something at least. The India field experiment on management, whether that matters, that in the end took at least a couple of years for the first round, then another decade for the second round. These might be extreme examples, but still, you have to convince the company of running this, and you have to set it up, and it's just much more resource and time consuming than doing it in the lab. We have participants who sort of are going about their life, their work life, so they're embedded in real life, meaning the stakes might also be higher for the Indian textile companies. It wasn't just participating in a lab experiment and then hopefully being the best. This was about survival. This was about making a profit. This was about which of the textile companies might sort of be profitable in the long term. So this is just this is not an exhaustive list. This is just to illustrate that there are trade-offs. A field experiment is not necessarily better. It depends on the research question. It depends on what we prioritize, internal or external validity. Here I've just put in a question from a former re-exam set in 2018, where one was explicitly asked to compare two studies that sort of addressed a similar question. One was a lab study, one was a field study. So just to illustrate that this has emerged, in how this could emerge in an exam setting. Finally, I just want to say that we also do have other kinds of experiments that are not sort of clearly a lab or a field experiment. We could, for instance, do a survey experiment, which are quite easy to pull off. I know many of you in your bachelor project or in your master thesis will do a survey study. But what is being done here is, you can imagine that you want to ask about, in this case, is something about fairness and earnings. And the original question was, a 50-year-old man with vocational training is working as a programmer and earns 1,200 euros a month. Is this fair or not? Well, we could make it a 50-year-old woman or a 40-year-old man with or without education, or we could change the occupation. We can change the question in many different ways and then see, well, let's say we do it with a 48-year-old man. Would that constitute a substantial difference in terms of how respondents will assess whether getting 1,200 euros a month is fair or not? Or maybe more obviously, we can change it to a woman or someone with another education. So we can investigate a question not by asking everyone the same survey question in order to find out what people think about a particular scenario, but we can ask them different kinds of scenarios in order to find out what really matters. So we could be interested in vaccines and how willing people are to take a vaccine, and then we can ask the questions in different ways in order to really get to a better and more clear answer than if we just sort of ask it in one way. So this would also be something that is possible to pull off in a bachelor project and a master thesis, if this fits the research question. I, for instance, supervised a project where the students wanted to sort of investigate the role of influencers in social media, and then they compared, so what if an influencer that is either very well known or not very well known promotes a product that is very well known or not very well known. This sort of simplified version of the project they had. And then they sent out a survey experiment where they manipulated a few of the features of the survey and got different kinds of responses, and then could provide an informed answer on the role of influencers in terms of being able to promote products. We have to keep in mind here with these survey experiments that they capture perception. They capture what we think about this situation, about whether this is fair or not. This does not mean that this is how we will actually act. Maybe we will have different reactions if we actually meet someone who fits this categorization. Same with the social media study. Maybe people will respond differently if they are on an actual social media site rather than answering surveys in an artificial survey experiment setup. It's something we'll return to in a later session. But just sort of to emphasize, a survey experiment by nature, what you get is how people sort of tick a box, which is very different from a field experiment where you actually want to see how behavior changes. But this is just to highlight that, yes, I make a main contrast between lab and field experiments, but we could actually imagine other kinds of experimental setups.